Judy Haiven is the co-founder of Equity Watch and part of the National Steering Committee for Independent Jewish Voices Canada. She worked for nearly 20 years as a professor of industrial relations at St. Mary's University in Halifax. Now her main focus is left-wing activism and political writing. As a Jewish person who supports Palestinian human rights, her voice is a powerful source of moral courage at a time when the ongoing genocide in Gaza is still being cloaked in claims that opposing Zionism is tantamount to anti-Semitism. We talk about that conflation in this interview and why it's become a means of explaining and excusing the inexcusable, a reign of terror and a commitment to killing children, erasing families, and committing genocide in Gaza. Haiven bluntly explains that the way anti-Semitism has evolved is that it's now profoundly attached to criticism of Israel specifically. What do we do in that situation? How do we find clarity? What will it take to gain enough political traction for the liberation of Palestine from Western imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism to become possible? But I want to say before we get to the interview that I'm at a point where I can't help but feel that continuing to talk and write about Palestine is falling short. Harsha Walia mentioned this on social media recently, that she's humbled by the many calls for her to weigh in, to publicly speak to the unrelenting nightmare. What she said is that she's ambivalent about writing because it is, quote, so jarring to have spent years connecting and organizing against violences in multiple places, registers, and geographies, and for it to be exploding all around us. I continue to give a platform to anti-colonial communicators, though, because the common sense assumption still seems to be that Palestinians are not our equals. Their lives do not matter to the same extent that the lives of other human beings matter. But the overwhelming destruction, the Zionist wrath that's been inflicted upon Palestine is impossible to ignore now. We are living in the aftermath of a foreseeable slaughter, which no one seems capable of stopping. How do we reckon with this reality? How do we stop its perpetuation? How does it become imaginable?
I hesitate to start by talking about Donald Trump, but it does make sense. I mean, he, in his, return to the White House has made it clear the extent to which the United States is going to be supporting Israel, and it has shocked a lot of the world. Like the way he articulated it in this press conference is he says, I do see a long-term ownership position when it comes to Gaza, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East, and maybe the entire Middle East in like a characteristically Trumpian fashion, using that hyperbole. And, he talks about studying it over months, which is doubtful, but he, ultimately says that, yes, Gaza is, it's interesting, he uses this phrase, a symbol of death and destruction. But when pressed on who would live in this redeveloped Gaza, Trump says it would become a home to the world's people, which is like a feel-good phrase that disguises, I think, an awful lot. And, he reveals what is being disguised, I think, when he says, like, I don't want to be a wise guy, but it could be the Riviera of the Middle East, something that could be so valuable. Valuable, I think, is the key term. I mean, like, this is also in the context of an executive order threatening supposed jihadist sympathizers with deportation under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism. There's all this stuff going on, and it does feel like institutions are crumbling in a way in the face of this, this issue, right? The question of Palestine. Do you think it's a fair assessment and prediction to say, like, in some ways these systems are crumbling, whether it's the university or governmental norms, international law, and so on? What is basically being revealed by this fairly, I think, authoritarian notion of just intervening to force Gaza into like other hands, basically?
The first thing I'd say is that I think all these American organizations, and to some extent the Canadian organizations that are withering on the vine because Trump is screaming and yelling and stomping around, They are actually jumping before they're being pushed. And that's the
Mm,
most amazing thing to me. I don't understand,
mhm,
and I guess it's because of my politics. And the most important lesson I ever learned was never jump. Never jump. Because at the
mm,
last minute, certain things can happen. And even if they
mm,
don't happen, you need to make them push you. The idea is
mhm,
that you don't get out of the way because they ask you to. I
mhm.
think that this is why some of the more, and you and I would say liberal organizations in the United States today, they're all just being sidelined and being scared half to death by Trump. That's what I would say.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure whether, I don't think there's any real way around it. He's a bully. And what's shocking to me is the reaction of people to bullies.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, like, this is one of the lessons, I guess, of Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny, right? Like, don't
Right.
accede in advance.
So,
Like, don't simply,
no.
um, and I think like people do feel kind of pinched between these like powerful political and cultural forces, and especially folks that are scared by how complicated it all feels. It's hard to like, contest perhaps this conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I wanted to talk about that. There does seem to be a sincere belief among Zionists that it wasn't a history of oppression that caused the October 7th attack. It was age old anti Semitism of Palestinians, I think what Traverso calls an ancestral and unquenchable hatred of the Jews, right? And we know that like anti Semitism in previous intifadas is not really a part of Palestinian resistance anymore, right? Like the problem is that that narrative is powerful, and it does seem to be constantly reinforced by propaganda. Do you feel like there's any discursive or rhetorical way to like overcome this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or is it just like an inevitable consequence of contesting Israeli settler colonialism?
Oh, I think, of course, the real question about anti Semitism is that it doesn't exist, especially in the Western world, in the way the pro Israel and the pro, Zionist lobby says. It doesn't exist that way. And the proof of the
Hmm,
pudding is the fact that even if I were to say, I happen to have a sister who's a real big shot in culture in Canada. She runs probably the premier cultural organization in this country. Real big shot. She's in Ottawa, Montreal, goes all over all the time, starts museums, does all these things and makes money. But when I once said to her a few years ago, well, how's there anti-Semitism when Larry and I got jobs at a formerly Catholic university, when there is not one Jew in this country who's been refused hospital privileges if he's a qualified doctor? You're not refused
hmm,
I don't know in Halifax, but in general, you get hospital privileges if you're a doctor. And not one Jew's been denied hospital privileges that I'm aware of. There's not one Jew who's been denied a chance to work for a board of education or a chance to work at a community college or been denied a job, for instance, in the federal civil service at a high level, or in fact denied a job anymore with the diplomatic corps of Canada. There are tons of Jews who are employed there all the time. How can it be that we're talking about anti Semitism when none of the above exists anymore? We can buy houses where, if we have money, wherever we like. We can go where
hmm,
we like. There's no, you don't have to marry anybody. There's no, there's no downside. Uh, But they're
hmm,
saying there's no such, no, you're thinking of the old anti Semitism, Judy. The new anti Semitism is stuff that's anti Israel. So, what they've
right.
successfully done, the Zionists, is they've persuaded many, many Jews to ignore any of the things that we were all attuned to for the last 50 years or since the Second World War or something, 80 years or something. We don't have to pay attention to that. And instead, we just have to pay attention to whether Israel is being treated fairly or not. This is something that's
Hmm,
totally anathema. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. Yet all these people are buying it. And as you say,
hmm,
that's exactly their line. Their line is, hey, we're not doing anything bad. Look at all these anti Semites out there. And the Palestinians are among the worst. They claim. But we know,
Yeah.
factually speaking, that's not true. And there's very little history of anti-Semitism actually in among the
Hmm.
Palestinian people. I would say it's extremely low. Considering what's
Hmm.
happened to them since 1948, you would think they would be more visibly shaken than they seem to be about Jews.
Right, and that there could be theoretically this kind of like vendetta, like a kind of racial
Right.
vendetta, as it were. But that's not what exists. It seems like what exists is a profound desire for
Right.
freedom that is being suppressed, and that sort of conflation seems to serve that
Right.
suppression. It feels, you mentioned before we started
Mhm.
talking that it feels like I'm kind of interested in understanding the history, and you're kind of more concerned about like the future. And I absolutely want to, devote time to thinking about possible solutions to this intractable thing. But yeah, I think it is important to some extent to establish at least a longer history of collusion between the US and
Oh,
Israel. Like, Nora Erakat has that book, Justice for
yes.
Some, that gives like a really great decoding of it. She says, U.S. administrations have systematically undermined nearly all Palestinian efforts to internationalize its conflict with Israel. She notes that the U.S. has used its Security Council veto 43 times, I think more than that now, from
Yes.
72 to 2017, to protect Israel. And like, it does seem like part of the point in Ericat's history is to stress that like none of that was predestined, right? Like it wasn't inevitable that Israel would become a kind of outpost of imperialism for the United States. That happened through a historical process. But I'm wondering now about the US's role in sustaining Israel as its outpost, like right now, because you've got people like Robert F. Kennedy saying on the campaign trail that Israel is, quote, almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Middle East, right? Like, it's true, but it's like, how is that not interpreted as an egregious affirmation of that collusion, right? Like, how does the US see maintaining this military edge in Israel over all other Middle Eastern countries as a core part of its geopolitical strategy? And do you think it actually serves the US?
Without the US, of course, a place like Israel would fall flat. You can't have that kind of a war effort and that shocking an effort that they have without a tremendous amount of money and arms. I think the United States is trying to salvage the relationship and do whatever they can to keep the relationship with Israel because it's a pandering country. It's a country that identifies with the United States. It's a country where they have extradition. It's a country where a lot of the richest a lot of the richest Jews in the United States and ones that back either side of the house, they send their money. This is the Holy Grail. As far as the US is concerned, it's the millions of Jews who have a disproportionate amount of power or powerful positions in society in the United States compared to their numbers. And this is not lost on anyone who saw the people behind Harvard and all those universities which lost their presidents or had their presidents demoted or
Sure.
something like that way back 6 months
Yeah.
ago. Tremendously wealthy people that have this allegiance. I prefer, for a second to speak about Canada because I know it so well. We have a
Hmm.
situation where 2 days ago we watched the press conference with Birju Dutani. And as you know, Birju Dutani was a man who's perhaps 40 years old or 45. And he had been the successful candidate in being the CEO of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, arguably the top human rights job in the country, arguably. And a month or 2 weeks before he was, a few months before he was set to take over that job, he applied and was successful. The Jewish establishment went to the government and insisted that he couldn't have the job. And you could remember this back in June. The government got so worried because, of course, Trudeau's numbers were falling, of sympathetic people were falling, that he ordered that an independent law firm in Toronto, I think it is, that has nothing to do with Jews at all or anybody at all, inquire and find out and look at all of Detani's records and see if there was a issue of anti-Semitism ever in his past, as an adult, that
Mm.
is, in his past. And they came out with a report at the end of June saying there's absolutely nothing to indicate the man is an anti-Semite, that the man hates Jews, that the man has been on a campaign against Jews, all of the things he was accused of. But
Hmm.
even still, in August, when he was supposed to be taking on his new job, he announced that he had resigned before he even took a day on the job, and the government admitted that they wanted him out. So now, 2 days ago, we saw him in a press conference in Ottawa at the National Press Gallery, I think, saying that he is going to sue three Jewish institutions. In one also was a member of the House of Commons who's Jewish, the one from Thornhill. I think I've blocked out her name, but she was also being sued by him. So he has had to use the law because his life is worth nothing. At the age of 45, he'll never work again, except maybe as a dog
Mm.
catcher. Because once you're accused of being an anti Semite and your job is human rights, you're finished. And it doesn't
Right.
matter how he was cleared by this independent legal authority that didn't, the legal authority was not Cracker Jack's box. It was reasonable people, I'm sure. He was cleared by all these people. But the fact of the matter is that the Jews in this country will never accept somebody like him, a brown person who's of Muslim background. I think he's an Ismaili Muslim, if I get my facts straight on that. And in other words, a very much a westernized Muslim. Ismaili Muslims
Mm.
are, particularly in colonial situations, are the Muslims that the Christians can accept, right? That's who the
Mm.
Ismaili Muslims are. And that's what
Right.
his background is, Calgary. And this man will never work again unless he sues successfully, I guess. And I guess then he's got to hope that everybody knows he's been successful at suing
Mm.
for defamation. But I look at that case and I see to myself, if this had been years ago, maybe there could be a support committee. Maybe across the country, people could have united and banded together to say, we want Detani to be the head of the Human Rights Commission and we're not going to take it. But instead, he's had to go the route of a lawsuit in order to get any form of justice.
I mean, that's sickening and a symptom of this political climate that we exist in, where it is, it is perfectly safe, it seems, to take the party line, depending on, I guess, on the spaces that you're in. The party line being this institutional, reinforcement of Israel's right to self-defense, etc. But across the board, sympathizing with Palestinians is still a risk.
Yes.
And I wonder if you think that it's still the kind of profaneness, the kind of the cultural stigma attached to the figure of the terrorist that is in part the basis of the West's official support for even this level of genocidal erasure, right? I'm thinking back to the legacy of Edward Said, who, Mohammed El-Kurd cites when he talks about how the terrorists are seen as, quote, almost mythical creatures, the stuff of scary stories, big bad wolves with furrowed eyebrows, sharp fangs, and terrifying political incorrectness. Even Said might be shocked to see Israel waging war on Palestine every 2 years, basically,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
This extermination
Absolutely.
campaign. But do you feel that, like, complicity with violence of this scale almost requires the creation of that figure? And, like, how is that maybe feeding into this, really binaristic kind of, understanding of Israel versus Palestine, almost as, like, a question of political allegiance rather than a question of justice?
There's a person called Marilyn Garson who is a Jew from Canada, from Halifax, believe it or not. But one of the
Mm.
things that she's written, and she's just written a book, this very interesting book about why she doesn't support Israel. That's just been published. It's her
Mm.
second book. And she's a very clever person. She says
Mm.
her way of speaking is that Palestinians are my equals, she says. And that almost made me fall off my chair because
Mm.
everywhere, every bone in my body says they're not. They're not. I mean, from the day one, I knew they weren't my equals. I'm not saying that in a proud way, but as a Jew, this is the way you're raised, and it's intrinsic, no matter how liberal. My parents were liberal
Right.
minded. I mean, I wouldn't be me if they weren't somewhat liberal minded, not about Israel, but about other things
Mm.
they were liberal minded. The thing is, when she says, Palestinians are my equals, it's almost breathtaking for me because I've never thought about it like that. They Palestinians are my equals. The thought that they're my equals, if Jews took that into account, there would be no more war and no more fighting ever. Because as soon as you say
Mm.
somebody's your equals, you're not going to fight them. It's just like the NLF in
Hmm.
Vietnam. Whoever thought they were my equals? Never. But of
Right.
course, I had nothing to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
with them, and I never knew any Vietnamese people, frankly. And I mean, there were no Jews over in Vietnam. I never thought about it. Of course, I thought about it because I was pro NLF, but it's the same kind of argument. They're not, they are my equals. All of a sudden, you raise them to what you are today and what your children are today, and you
Mm.
think, oh my God, what are we doing to them?
And it has to be in part because of the stuff that Mohammed El-Kurd is
Yes,
really exploring
yes,
in this new book, Perfect
that's
Victims,
right.
right? Which is that, he's really kind of trying to theorize how even in their victimhood, maybe especially in their victimhood, Palestinians are not precisely regarded as full human beings. Or if they are, they're sort of positioned in a way and framed as, objects of our pity, perhaps, but not
No,
agents. Not agents who have like disdain for their
no, no,
occupier
no.
and a desire to resist, right?
If we all believe that, let's say all of us in Canada, everybody, I don't mean just Jews, but I mean all kinds of liberal minded people.
Right.
If all the people in the NDP and on the kind of right of the NDP, if they all agreed with that statement from Marilyn, things would have changed quite a lot here. A lot. There would be half the number of people, if that, even thinking about being nice to pro-Israel types or Jews that are in favor of Israel. If they even thought about that, because it just sets you back. Are they my equals? Of course they are. But then why are we doing this?
There's an othering. There's an
Yes,
inevitable othering. I mean, Said, of course, seminally talks about how, you create
right,
this kind of ideal other that
right,
is perpetually, stuck in the past. It shrinks, in El-Kurd's terms, the scope of humanity
right.
and reinforces, he says, this hierarchy of suffering. But in this moment, I've talked to Abdel Jawad Omar, who's a brilliant writer in the West Bank, and he says, like, we are at the absolute height of the Palestinian liberation movement right now. And part of that, like, you can see the way in which watching Palestinians return to their indigenous homeland is actually like inspiring a level of, if not optimism, like
Right.
resolve in the people who are witnessing that. And yet, these are people who are returning to a wasteland where the scale of death will be unbelievable, right? Do you think that right now it's true that we are experiencing, in a way, the height of Palestinian solidarity, and that maybe the world is better able to grasp the fact that Palestinian lives matter, that they are our equals, that we should experience some level of horror right now because of that?
Well, you would think so, but the whole tyranny of World War II and what the Jews and their sympathizers have done since then to protect the Jews in the diaspora and to make sure that the Jews have a reasonably comfortable life and all of that kind of thing, that's going to be very hard to tear apart. Though I agree with you. I agree with everything what you just said. I think that's true. I think also
Hmm.
that the people in the South or the people in the disadvantaged part of our world see it very clearly
Hmm.
because they've been disadvantaged and shat on and spat on and junked up and all that stuff. All the people in the southern parts of the
Hmm.
world. But the people in the West and the diaspora, it's just a huge, big problem. And I don't know what's going to provide. Maybe when Biden dies and people who are 87 die, I used to think when they died, this would all be over. Then I thought when people who are 77 died. But now I see people who are 51 who are ardent Zionists and crazy people, in my view, and they ain't going to die for
Hmm.
a long, long time. You
Hmm. So you can't wait it
know,
out,
no, I
it
don't think, I
feels
thought
like.
we could, but we can't wait it out. No, 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 I
Yeah.
don't think
And I mean, like, part of that is just, it feels like it's built into the colonial infrastructure, like Rebecca Stein
Yes.
writes about how the view, the actual like ability to see occupied
Yeah.
Palestine is obscured in Israel, right? Like it's blocked by concrete. She says it's reflective of, quote, an implicit agreement within mainstream Israeli society fostered by the state to keep the military occupation out of sight. And in fact, that good Israeli citizenship depends on it. You've traveled there. I mean, you've been there. How powerful did you find that obscuring to be, and how can it be actually sustained? Like, it's hard for somebody who hasn't been there to understand how that gets sustained.
I think it's sustained like that film that won the Academy Award last year, Zone of Interest. You see exactly a concrete wall is between these people who have a very upper middle class with maids, with everything, kind of fabulous existence, with a beautiful garden and a swimming pool and you name it. And they are literally 30 feet from the concentration
Right.
camp wall at Auschwitz or someplace like that. And so
Mm-hmm,
you really
mm-hmm,
see how things, and when they hear things, they dismiss them. So when I think
mm,
about Israel and I think about the zone of interest issue, because we have people, as I've written lately, that live maybe all of 60 kilometers, 30 kilometers from what's going on, and they have no knowledge, and they'll tell you it's not happening. And
mm,
this is a shocking thing to me. But you have,
mm,
as you say, you have to have this in order to keep the colonization going and to keep the violence going. You have to have this. And just
mm,
this morning, we were listening, Larry and I were listening to something, and I am not sure if it was something with Gideon Levy or who it was, but it turns out that only 3% of Israeli Jews, only 3% believe there's a moral issue with what's going on in Gaza. 3%.
3%. So virtually
None.
none, you
Yeah,
could
you could
argue,
argue
right?
none. And this
Yeah.
new statistic is so shocking. I've read it today as well. I just had somebody over who was from Israel, who was here, but she went to Israel to find her father. Her real father
Mm,
lives there. She's a Jew, but
mm,
she didn't grow up with him. So she went to Israel 3 years ago to meet up with him, and she's a grown up, and to see if what it was like. Would she like to settle there? Because I guess she has a chance to do that if she wanted to. This young woman
sure.
here.
Right.
And she was just explaining to us just before we got on this call how horrible it really is. And she was a very apolitical person. Now she's become this big anti-Zionist. And she said 3 years of living there have taught her where she doesn't want to be. Now, she, of course,
Yeah.
she's not doing so well in this country because, in a way, she's come back to a country where there are fewer jobs for her. She is a counterculture type. Uh, but she said you cannot even speak up on the level we're speaking in Israel today unless you're part of the aristocracy. Nobody wants to know you. Nobody wants you to be in their organization. If you and I had to zoom over there today and join a club or join an organization to fight the occupation, no one would even accept us. We're not.
Hmm.
There's too much suspicion of outsiders.
Right. Um, who said this? That basically the West will never recognize the figure of a humanity that fights back, right? And so, this liberal, inclusive humanism is a dead end in some ways when it comes to solidarity with Palestine. But the other side of this apartheid system of containment and exclusion is, of course, the experience of Palestinians who are placed outside the normal state of
Yeah,
law and subjected to a kind of laboratory in Anthony Lowenstein's words,
exactly.
right? Where they're comprehensively surveilled, policed, and their lives destroyed, right? At very little with very little pretext. I mean, I just watched Lowenstein's two-part Al Jazeera documentary on YouTube, The Palestine Laboratory. And for me, the shocking part for anyone exposed to mostly Western journalism is the way that this series shows the impact of Israel's oppression on the lives of those in Gaza and the West Bank. And like, it is genuinely shocking, right? They're blurred images of the worst kinds of violence, but there's no filter, there's no screen that prevents you from actually, you know, confronting the human toll of this bombardment. Um, and I think, the documentary has a lot of power for that reason, but I still personally am skeptical, I guess, of mediation, of the media, because, you know, at what point do we actually believe that a documentary can move the needle, right? Isn't there a way in which it can be absorbed into the just general, content production machine of 21st century capitalism? I don't know. This is all a labyrinthine way of asking you whether you think that really hard-hitting journalism like that has an impact on changing people's attitudes and consciousness.
It doesn't seem to have the effect that we want it to. And no amount of truth telling, for you and me right now, if you went out to, I don't know, your local mall and handed out a leaflet saying, the Jews say this, it's wrong, and the Palestinians say this, and it's right, and you have to support them because they're the underdogs. Let's say we handed out leaflets at your mall. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that we are going to get anywhere with that. What occurred to me is that the older and the Jews that are educated in the Hebrew day schools, and apparently nowadays 50% of Canadian Jews were educated in Hebrew day, which shocks me because in my day, only the people that had the most reactionary and stupid parents would send them. Like people like my parents who went to
Mm.
university would never send their kids to a crap school like that. Never. But to one where there was no questioning and it was all rote learning. But now 50% are sending them basically to Hebrew day. And
Yeah.
this would be in Montreal, Ottawa, Winnipeg has it. Edmonton had it when we lived there. They had a Hebrew
Mm.
day school that was totally funded by the government. Not that I sent my
Mm.
kid there, but I mean, they had it. It was free.
It was
It was
there,
free
yeah.
in Edmonton and one in Calgary. They had
Wow.
one in Calgary and one in Edmonton in those days. And they didn't have one in
Mm.
Saskatchewan. They had them, but they had them in Manitoba. In some provinces like Quebec and like Manitoba and Alberta, they're state funded. So the thing about all of this, though, is that the Jewish institutions are very wealthy and very well connected. They're also well connected to politicians. So, I mean, Erwin Kotler has a lot of snakes in the cupboard or something like that. But when we think of it, politicians are not going to step on his toes. Chrétien never stepped on his toes. He never understood him, but he never stepped on his toes. Trudeau wouldn't, the younger, wouldn't step on him. Nobody is going to step on his toes. And the
Mm-hmm.
same goes for other people who are very high up in the Jewish community. I mean, Michael Levitt is another person that no one steps on him. We write letters to the editor. We can't even get them in the Toronto Star. He had a column
Mm.
every single month or every 2 weeks or something in the Toronto Star that was just Zionism 101. It was unbelievable. He was a member
Mm-hmm.
of parliament. I think Toronto, I can't remember, somewhere Toronto. And now he's the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation, which means that they're paying him more than the government of Canada paid him to sit in the House of Commons. Michael Levitt is a huge weather vane for the Jewish community.
Mm.
He was a member of parliament and now he has this illustrious job in the mainstream Jewish community. I
Yeah.
guess what I'm really trying to say is that there are people in very high places in this country who are pushing this line against Palestine, really against Palestinians, against Gaza, in favor of murder and genocide. And these people are very high up. They're also high up in
Mm-hmm.
cultural institutions. We know that. We know that even though university presidents don't tend to be overly political because it doesn't suit them and that's not their temperament and they don't need it, we know that even at places like U of T, Merrick Gertler, who is a classic liberal, if you talk to, not that I've only read about him, and I know people who know him, they say to me, if you asked him about anything, he's a classic middle-aged, older guy liberal. But on the question of Israel, he won't do a thing. And he's a Jew. He won't do a thing. And yet
Right.
he must know in the deep night of the soul, as you and I would call it, the deep night of the soul,
Mm.
that what Israel's doing is not right. He's a
Right.
geographer or something. He comes from his social science. I'm sure he doesn't think, oh, yeah, murdering 50,000 children is a good idea. I don't think he thinks that. No. But we see it
Right.
here even. We see all kinds of leaders, community leaders in the Jewish community who have taken terrible positions on Israel. You might not listen. Occasionally, I have to listen to um, White Coat Black Arts or something, or
Oh yeah,
the
yeah.
one
The CBC
medical
medical
thing. If I'm
podcast,
cleaning
kind
the
of.
kitchen
Yeah.
or something, I'm listening to it, but I won't listen now because I know that the uh, doctor who's the presenter is a raving, absolutely he's a Jewish guy and he's a raving Zionist. Has always been, always. But now he's even more
Right.
raving. So I can't even, but he's a message manager in the bigger world in this country. So the Canadian Medical
Right.
Association has him as a member, and I'm sure he goes and speaks all the time about Zionism and
Right.
how justified it
Cool.
is. But that's just an example. All he is a radio host of a show about medical establishment.
Right. I mean, what you said there about, especially like, you know, reading and engaging with all of the work that Zionists
Right.
are doing, you know, made me think about how Naomi Klein right now
Right.
with the Doppelganger
Yes.
book is really trying to like monitor closely all of this, you know, far right rhetoric coming out of especially like Steve
Yes.
Bannon's show and all of these things. Like she does it strategically in order to understand what these folks are, how these folks are maneuvering and manipulating politics. And one of the things she talks about is how Steve Bannon's whole strategy, his philosophy, he says it's about flooding the zone with shit. That's his whole thing. Is like you just flood the zone, meaning public consciousness, the public, with misinformation, disinformation,
Right.
propaganda, and that so muddies the waters that it's impossible to actually even get to the point where you're rationally talking about the problem and thinking about solutions. Like that's not the point, right? The point is in fact rampant far right style militarization of the social. That's really the
I
point.
agree.
But the way you get there is you flood the zone with shit. And it does feel like that's the place we're in right now.
Halifax Examiner has never written a word about what we do in Halifax or about how we've accrued a number of academics from the universities here to go and speak to the university presidents about support for Palestine. No matter what we write or what we send out in terms of press releases, in terms of independent Jewish voices, sends out to show that there's another side and it has to be paid attention to. It's never been even acknowledged, not even
Mm.
acknowledged in the Examiner. Now,
And for people that don't know, this is a left publication,
yes,
you could argue,
yeah,
in Halifax.
centrist anyway. I think he's an American, and what he understands of the real Canada, I'm not sure. The reason
Right.
he won't, or his reporters have been told, don't start the discussion, is because they don't want the blowback from the little mingy Jewish community in this town, which is made up of 1,500 hardy souls, of whom about 700 are true believers. And of the
Mm.
700, there might be 30 speakers. That's it. The rest are just old people, frankly. There's hardly any.
Mm.
And what I've seen, when I've written about this, in my gym class, I'm not allowed to wear keffiyeh. That was one of my posts that went like 5,000 hits the first time I published it, right? Or thousands,
Mm-hmm.
thousands, and thousands when I write about other things that happened. For instance, the woman who wore the dog tags to support her boys and girls who were coming home from being hostages. She was in the
Mm.
swimming pool the other day, this horrible woman, and she was wearing dog tags like in the army. And when I got close enough to look, it's all, the Hebrew script and everything. And what it's all about is save our hostages. She is one of the true believers, this older woman. But we're looking at almost no buy in anywhere. We can't get one thing published anymore.
Mm.
We don't get letters to the editor and we write them. Not just me. I'm not saying Judy does this, but we have a whole bunch of people here, a whole bunch of new members, especially since October 7th. We have tons of members who are young. We have tons of members who are
Mm.
26 and came here to be architects or something, professionals or something,
Mm.
planners, I think. And but we can't get anywhere with the media here. Nobody will take a chance. And this is just
Right.
one of the places no one will take a chance. We can't get anything
Yeah.
in many
Yeah.
cities where we are.
I mean, and you use the language of true believer, and there's a lot in that, I think, right? One of the ways in which Israel, it feels like, is untouchable is it's not a state like other
Mm.
states, obviously. It's an ethno state, and I think, Traverso talks about it as like a redemption
Ah,
project. Like that there's a way in which it does have this like, irrational basis in an attempt to like right historical wrongs to the extent that now apparently Germany requires recognizing the state of Israel as a access to citizenship, right? You have to state that you recognize Israel in order to be a German citizen. That's odd, right? So much of the question of Palestine has to do with that precise question of like sovereignty, the two-state solution or binational solution. I kind of wanted to ask your thoughts on that kind of formulation of the liberation of Palestine that sees either the two-state or binational solution as the only ways out of this, right? What's your sense of the state of that debate, either within the Jewish community or
Well,
broadly?
I read about it all the time, but the real story is I don't know what you do with this destroyed place. This place is totally
Right.
destroyed, and the way you and I are seeing it now, we think that within 3 months, to be honest, or 4 months, the West Bank is going to look something like that as well. They're killing and
It looks
killing
that
and they're
way.
destroying and they're bombing. And I heard somebody on a show today talk about how the bombs are going off very near Ramallah. This is the bombs and the destruction of the West Bank is just the next thing. The it clearly they've
Yeah.
never been stopped. Israel wasn't stopped for this so-called ceasefire, and they're just carrying on. So
Hmm.
I'm not sure that we're going to see the end of this anytime soon.
So yeah, I mean, I was just reading,
Yes.
I keep quoting it, Enzo
Yes.
Traverso's book. I think it's called Gaza Faces History, and he says that like his position is that a two-state solution would actually be tragic and lead to the impossibility of peace. That there's no, especially given the ways in which Palestine has been absolutely devastated and dominated. How can you, like, what would it look like to restore that to a state? And so Traverso suggests that um, a binational Israeli-Palestinian state might seem impossible, but there are ways in which it might be the only answer.
Well, of course, it
You
would
know,
be
yeah,
if the Jews didn't feel it was all or nothing. If it
right.
was, if there was anything that was responsible or there was any pressure that could be brought to bear. The only country,
Mm,
as you know, is the US that can bring the pressure to say to Israel, okay, it's got to be binational, we got to do this, you got to do that. But that's not going to happen. I don't
mm,
think that the Jews are going to allow this to happen. And I used to think it was just the Jews who were over 70 or something. And now I'm beginning to think it's Jews all the way up the ladder because of these Hebrew day schools. We've got people who
mm,
are true believers, and we've got people who, these Jews really don't have an independent mind or an independent sense of things. Also, the other thing, of course, is the wealth. They don't want to take a back seat and they don't want to have anything second rate. And in their view, a binational state would be second rate
mm,
because we know that if Palestinians are not my equals, having an equal state, if you could even imagine it, is not going to
mm.
go anywhere. The level of racism against the Arabs and the Palestinians is shocking beyond belief. It's
Right.
shocking considering they had nothing to do with World War II, nothing to do with any concentration camp. They had nothing to do with throwing someone in Auschwitz. They had nothing to do with anything.
I mean, yeah, and the figure of 3%, right? 3% of those in Israel believe there, it's a problem at all. I did speak with Gideon Levy for the
Right,
podcast, and he talked about what it means to be an
right,
oppositional anti-Zionist Jew in Israel right now, and how isolating it
right,
is. And I mean, he talks about only learning that the Nakba existed at like 26, right? Like this, like you're an adult and you're finding out for the first time that you've oppressed an entire people. And his response is to let in the guilt
right.
and the shame. That's not the default response, you
To
know?
fight it.
Um,
Because if
yeah.
you are a person who believes that the Jews are the best, and you hear it all the time in the community, you have to marry a Jew. They're the best husbands. They're the best. They're best at making money. Every Christian I know tells me Jewish doctors are the best. Why would they even say that? Why? To curry favor with me, yes. That's what they're
Mm.
doing. They're currying favor with me. But it's a whole area that people and that frankly Jews in Canada have tried to show they're the best at this, they're the best university professors, the best qualified doctors, the best professionals, they're involved in politics.
Right, and it kind of feeds into the narrative that Netanyahu has been trying to kind of advertise, which is that um, the Israeli state is the gift, is the
I agree.
blessing, whereas these other forces are effectively a kind of curse,
I
right?
agree.
Like these competing forces of history, one capitalist overdevelopment, the other a kind of barbarism, right?
Right.
But I guess I want to ask you one more question about, you know, it's a question of where you get inspiration and strength from, not a question of optimism, pessimism, all that stuff. It's, you know, because I know through conversations with you, reading your blog, conversations with your son Max, that there is a deep tradition of internationalism within Judaism, and it stands automatically in opposition to Zionism. Well, I wonder, I guess, as a secular Jew, whether you derive any sort of strength and inspiration from that. To what extent is there this radical tradition within Judaism that you think can and should be recuperated? And to what extent do you think, like, we don't need to worry so much about that? We should really just be focusing on this, you know, more cosmopolitan, non-religious, non-ethnic kind of notion of freedom, of emancipation in and of itself, of equality as a goal.
I don't agree with Max at all. Not at all on that.
Mm.
I'm not a big internationalist, and I don't agree with that. I lived in this country where there wasn't one Canadian publisher. I lived in a first university degree where I never had one Canadian citizen to be my professors because they were all American draft dodgers. That's what I lived through. So I'm not a big person to say, well, let's just be these big internationalists and hope it works out. I didn't see that. I think we have to be influential on the Canadian establishment and influential on everything we can be in this country to try and shift things. I think that we have to fight where we are to try and put the Palestinian cause in the right perspective, and to actually demonstrate that in this country we shouldn't be scared because of what the Zionists are saying. We also have to be able to unveil the problem of the evangelical and the other churches. Just to give you some idea, at the YMCA, two of the women that are staff members that do training frequently our paths cross. I don't know why, and I know them slightly. Both of them are these big born-again Christians, and both of them refuse to speak to their pastors about their undying support for Israel. So I'd say that's a better thing for me to focus on. So all these born-again preachers, and there are tons of them, Pentecostal, you name it, man, they're across this country. All these guys, and also to some degree the Catholics and to some degree the Protestants, they are not willing to stand up and say one bad word against the state of Israel and what it's doing, because it's the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy. It's the fulfillment in the book of Revelation. It's got to happen according to these Christians. But what I find incredible is the two trainers at the Y are very nice, and they love to help people with their physical fitness, things, but they would never question what their preachers say. Well, if we can't get people to question in a country like Canada what their religious leaders say, there's something going on. Because most religious leaders are not so influential in this country, but apparently they're highly influential when it comes to Israel. Highly. Who knew that they were so influential? So I think that we have a lot that we have to do. There was a man who was a human rights expert and a chemistry professor. His name was Israel Shahak in Israel. This is 40 years ago. He's long dead. And he did a study of where all the Jews were in different countries in the world, or where they were. And he measured in some way, I don't know how in those days, he measured their views on Palestine. And what he found was that the most reactionary Jews in the world were in Canada and in Mexico. The most reactionary. And that's because of when most Jews came here. Most Jews came here after World War II. Now, so I'm an exception. My husband's an exception because our parents came in the 20s. But the ones that came after World War II are extremely reactionary. Many of the 524 Jewish physicians in that organization I've written about in Toronto, they're all totally reactionary. Yet they're all between the ages of 45 and 65. And they all went to university and became medical doctors and are relatively rich, yet they're all very reactionary. All those people
Yeah, and we live right now in an unbelievably reactionary time where like reactionariness is absolutely the norm, I think.
agree.
And I like that you kind of like invoked that as like a primary issue that we need to confront, is this like reactionary politics, and also that you kind of stress that we do need to fight where we are. Yeah, I really appreciate you giving me your time and so much to think about. Yeah, it's been really great talking to you.
But it's been great talking to you too, because